Well, all right, it's March 19. This is 250, real ear measurement, fitting methods in real ear, or basically all that kind of stuff. So what we are on now is unit, I believe, 6. I think we're on today's real ear. What did I tell you last week? I said last week we would begin unit 6, today's real ear. So there you go. So we have graduated from the old real ear, which was insertion gain, measured by real ear aided response minus real ear unaided response, giving you REIG. And when you read anything with the letter G, stands for only gain. And every time you're seeing gain, you're looking at dB. And if the 4-letter acronym ends in R, you're talking output, real ear aided response. So they basically looked at real ear unaided response, good old outer ear canal resonance, and they subtracted that from the real ear aided response, and you got real ear insertion gain, and then they see if that matches the target. And that's got 2 problems with it, we said a couple of weeks ago. One problem is you're focusing on REUR when you didn't incorporate REUR in your measurement of hearing because you plugged the ear with headphones. So you drove a truck over that. And the other thing is it's a very poor counseling tool because it doesn't describe what parts of speech are aided or what parts of speech are audible, aided versus unaided. So enter today's real ear, which is MoBetta. So we'll look kind of at some of that today. And even this system that I'm showing you here is an old, outdated system by AudioScan. They don't even use that anymore. It's been updated considerably, but there's the old, original real ear system from 150 years ago. Do you know, when I was going to school studying audiology at OU in Oklahoma City, this model was just coming out, and I think the year was like 1993. I mean, this was ages ago. You can't buy this system anymore except on an antique shop on eBay. At any rate, manufacturers' first fits are a shot in the dark, as we've seen before, and this is an ad put out by these guys and these guys. So what kind of system are people all using? There's tons of real ear systems by Metarex, systems by Oracle, systems by Fry, systems by AudioScan. So and it's not like one real ear system is better than the other. I tend to prefer AudioScan because I think its readout is simpler, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily the best. Sam, what kind of real ear system are you guys using where you're located?
It's an AudioScan. It's
an AudioScan? Yeah. Do you know what model it is? Ours, the ones we use at Douglas College here in Vancouver, are the Axiom.
It's the updated version. It came out 2 years ago, I believe. So it's the newer one.
Okay. On AudioScan, it's very, very simple to switch between insertion gain and speech mapping. It's very easy to switch. It isn't always all that easy to switch on other real ear systems. So for a teaching tool, I really like the AudioScan because I can flip from one to the other and say, this is what they used to do, and this is what we do today. But
yeah, it's very user-friendly.
What's that?
It's very user-friendly.
It is. I find it too. Very user-friendly. Yeah. So looking at a typical fitting here. Now, I know I'm missing something at 1500 hertz here, and I'm missing something at, well, there isn't anything between 250 and 500, but one particular target here is gone. And you can look at this particular fitting as today's real ear fitting according to a particular fitting method. This one was DSL version 5 for a child. And notice how high up the targets are. This is going to be the targets that are plotted for average inputs of, say, 65. So when you're looking at the green targets here, and you can see the stimulus was speech, and the input level was average of about 65. Now, if you're looking at this and you might think, okay, here's unaided speech, and it's laying there. This is long-term average speech spectrum, unaided. And so you can see the mean average is sitting right there along this line. And you can see the top end of it and the bottom end of it. And there's about a 25 to 30 decibel dynamic range inside speech. And that just means that the peak to valley contrasts in the speech waveform, because speech gets louder and softer, the peak to valley contrast is about 30 dB. And so when you're drawing a spectrum, when you're drawing a waveform, you've got intensity over time. Then when you're drawing a spectrum, you've got frequency and intensity. So looking at the spectrum, it's usually about 30 dB wide. And that's unaided. And you can see exactly what parts are audible to this particular client and what parts are inaudible. And the purpose, of course, is to be able to lift this up where it belongs, and that would make the speech audible. And that's why today's fitting methods that's why we call it the mapping of speech. And actually, it's AudioScan that cornered that word, that kind of has a patent on that particular word, but everybody uses it today anyway, so we've all ripped it off. But nonetheless, you can, you're noticing the style of hearing aid. They call it on-ear measurement, presentation, single view, and basically you're looking at what type of headphone was used, etc., etc. Real ear to coupler difference, average, was chosen. This is another big thing of today's real ear, is that you get a choice between choosing average uncomfortable loudness levels or measured uncomfortable loudness levels, frequency-specific uncomfortable loudness levels. Real ear to coupler difference. Now, let's just kind of talk a little bit about that. RECD. The 2cc coupler is larger than the closed ear canal. The closed ear canal is between 1 to 1.5 cubic centimeters. The 2cc coupler has a volume of air of about 2 cubic centimeters. An average RECD is about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz and about 5 dB below 1,000 hertz. Essentially, if you're looking at an ANSI measurement and you're looking at OSPL 90, or you're looking at full-on gain or reference test gain or whatever you're looking at, ANSI is all done on a 2cc coupler. So if you want to know what that's basically going to do on a real human ear, you can kind of divide it and keep it simple, because people make all these publications out of it, and I keep it simple. Average RECD is about 5 dB below 1,000 hertz and about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz. So if you add to that frequency response, lift it up by about 5 dB below and about 10 dB above 1,000 hertz, you'll get a pretty good idea of what the hearing aid's going to do on an average adult ear, as opposed to what it's doing on a 2cc coupler. So always remember that 2cc couplers, due to their larger size than the actual closed ear canal, the 2cc coupler always underestimates the sound that's taken place in the real human ear. Okay, it underestimates it because it's larger. If you make the space smaller, you got more bouncing of sound. You've got an increase. Okay, it's like putting mirrors in a room, or it's like making the room smaller. You got an increase of SPL. So this is the general thing. 2cc couplers underestimate. So average RECD, you increase what the output would be. Below 1,000 hertz by about 5, above 1,000 hertz by about 10. All right. So that's the average RECD. What happens if you look in someone's ear canal and the guy's got an abnormally large ear canal or an abnormally small ear canal? Then will the average RECD do? Not really. Then you should measure it. Then you should measure the average RECD. And real ear measurement easily includes that possibility. Real ear measurement today largely uses in situ REAR, I should say, which just means hearing aid in place, real ear, average aided response. It's actually easier than doing the old REAR minus REUR. You've just got one measure. Now you're doing this one measure 3 times. You're doing the one measure for average speech inputs, and then for soft speech inputs, and then for loud speech inputs. And you're looking to see where does your aided speech lie in the map. in the map of speech. Look at, here's the dynamic range of a normal hearing person. There's the floor, there's the ceiling. Okay, loudness, discomfort, and this is MAP, minimal audible pressure, or 0 dB HL. This is 0 dB HL spoken about in dB SPL. So when you baked in your thresholds here into the computer, and you were doing real ear measurement and you entered these thresholds, okay, in dB HL from your audiogram, the equipment automatically adds these values to the thresholds that you entered in dB HL, and it thereby changes them into dB SPL. For example, if this was a flat 50 decibel hearing loss, okay, pretend that this was a flat 50 dB hearing loss in dB HL. If you entered it here, it would look like about 70 here, because that's 50 dB above 20. And it would be an exact replica of this curve here, only 50 dB higher. Okay? So that's what I mean. A flat 50 dB HL hearing loss, as seen on a speech map doing real ear, is going to look like this bottom dotted line lifted up 50 dB. Okay, always keep in mind, this is minimal audible pressure, and that is 0 dB HL. So this person's dynamic range is smaller, and you can see his floor is elevated, and his loudness discomfort levels are pretty normal. So he's got the narrowest dynamic range here and a larger dynamic range in the lows, but it never matches the dynamic range of a normal hearing person. Nobody cares anymore about gain. Gain is a means to an end. Output rules, it's the groceries that are actually delivered to your tympanic membrane. So the audiogram, hearing loss reduces dynamic range. So the dynamic range is the decibel distance between the softest you can hear and the loudest you can tolerate. So on an audiogram, it would be shown here on the left, okay, and with a moderate sensory neural loss. No, I didn't draw the bone conduction scores in here, but pretend it's sensory neural. The UCL is similar to the other one, and the MCL would theoretically be right in the middle, theoretically, okay? Now, with linear hearing aids, whoa, okay, you had the same gain at all inputs. Speech was often at 70, dB SPL, 65, 70. Loudness discomfort levels often around 120. SPL. In HL, it's about 105. Okay, the difference between SPL and HL, if you've measured UCLs, loudness or LDLs, loudness discomfort level, UCL, uncomfortable loudness level, and if you happened to be using speech as your stimulus for it, you'd add about 15 to that. So if the loudness discomfort level for speech, or UCL for speech, was about 100 dB HL, I would choose a maximum power output of the hearing aid of around 115 dB SPL. That's because the difference between MAP here and 0, the average is about 15. Okay? That's why. Because MAP has an average lift of about 50, or it's about 15 dB SPL. You measured in HL, okay? Your hearing aids are measured in SPL. So if you have an uncomfortable loudness level of 100, you're going to add about 15 to it to talk in language of SPL. The idea behind old hearing aids, linear, was to place speech into the residual dynamic range of the listener. So if these were your target aided thresholds, according to Berger, Nall, Pogo, whatever it was, if you increase the thresholds by half, that meant by that inputs of average intensities like 65 dB SPL inputs or 50 to 60 dB HL inputs like average speech, because what's an average MCL? About 50 to 60 dB HL. What's an average MCL in terms of SPL? Well, what's average conversational speech? That gives you the average MPO, most comfortable loudness level. So MCL, most comfortable loudness level in terms of dBHL, is about 50 to 60. MCL in terms of SPL is between 65 to 70. Okay, so take either, let's look at HL because this is the language of HL. If I've improved the thresholds by half, then this improvement added to an average input of 50 to 60, average speech, will give me an aided speech output sitting nicely in the middle of the listener's dynamic range. Then you had real ear of yesterday, real ear unaided, real ear aided, the difference between real ear insertion gain, and you try to see if that matched the target. And always remember, the fitting methods didn't change. The target values here of this red line are the same as the targets here. It's just that your method of verifying was now non-behavioral. So hearing loss on a typical audiogram today, with today's real ear, we're doing everything in SPL, just like we did with yesterday's real ear, but we really don't give two hoots about real ear unaided response, and we really don't care about gain anymore. What we do care about is output only, and we want the outputs to be nicely mapped into the listener's dynamic range. So here's the audiogram in dBHL. You take these thresholds and the instrumentation automatically adds this value at 500, this value at 250, this value at 1,000, this value at 2, this value at 4, this value at 6 and 8. Adds those values to here to get these. Okay, that's the idea. So this is around 20, that's around 20, here you're at around 40. Dig? Okay, so that's how hearing loss is translated into SPL on an audiogram.
Doctor?
Unaided
Hi,
speech.
it's Angie. I can't get my view to come on my camera, but that's okay. I'm following along.
Good stuff.
The question I have for you, the question I have for you on the one slide, 4 or 5 slides ago, where you showed the dynamic range.
Okay,
and you said that, okay.
Let me see if I can get to that one.
Okie doke.
Let's look here, and it's going to be this one?
Nope. Yep, that one right there.
Yeah.
Okay, now tell me, because I'm thinking that this gentleman or patient is hearing from 20 dB to about 80, and that's it.
20 dB to 80. 20 dB to 80. No, this person here, this is his thresholds.
Okay, yes.
Okay, and here's his loudness discomfort levels.
Okay, is the thresholds obviously now making more sense? That's the lowest that he can hear.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Okay, so then he would only be hearing from, say, 38, 40 dB. Then up to, gosh, I guess loudness discomfort level.
Someone's phone is ringing away. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure where you're getting the 30. Yeah, he can hear from about 38 dB SPL.
Uh-huh.
Up to about 85, 90 dB SPL. That's his dynamic range.
Okay.
That's his decibel, that's his football playing field. This is his floor.
Okay.
Do you see my cursor moving here?
Yes.
That's his floor. This is his ceiling. Whereas to a normal hearing person, this is the floor.
That's the floor.
And that's the ceiling.
Thank you, doctor.
Oh, that's very good. I'm glad you asked. Maybe others would have had the very same question. So that's the whole idea. So here too, when you're looking at an audiogram, this is the floor, and that's the ceiling. And when you're looking at hearing loss, this is the floor, and this is the ceiling. But the audiogram should be spelled ODDIOGRAM, weirdogram, the audiogram, because the floor is on the top and the ceiling's on the bottom. So the beauty of doing today's real ear is it flips things right side up. And the audiogram is now plotted in dB SPL. So you've taken the audiogram right here that you may have had for somebody, and to change that into dB SPL, you are adding minimal audible pressure to it. And this added to this gives you this. So now your thresholds are plotted going up because the decibel values are going up instead of down. And you can see the listener's dynamic range right where my cursor is all spinning here. The normal dynamic range at 1,000 hertz, what might be from 10 to 110. This guy's dynamic range goes from 60 to 110. So the beauty of this now is that I can map aided outputs of speech into his dynamic range, and I can talk about what areas of speech are audible to him and what areas of speech literally lie below his thresholds. And the idea is to lift this orange banana and put it up here. So now all parts of speech become audible. Now don't forget we're using compression too. So this part here that sticks up above would be squeezed down here, so it would fit better, but it just gives you the idea. So when we're looking now, let's look at our notes here, see what we've got in today's real ear. The stimuli are different as well for today's real ear. So when you're looking at today's real ear, you've got early real ear used a sweep tone, or else some weird broadband noise. Today, we use speech-like stimulus. The audio scan uses the rainbow passage or the carrot passage. Carrots are a long vegetable grown in the spring. The roots are about blah, 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 blah. Carrots are found everywhere in the wild and blah, 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 blah. Okay? And other real ear systems use ISTS, I think some international speech to whatever, some weird stimulus that's formed out of about 5 or 6 different languages and has all the different starts and stops of speech. Anything to imitate speech-like stimuli. Pink noise, if you're going to use just noise, pink is better because pink noise has more energy in the lows and less in the highs, just like speech does. Okay? But and also when you're doing real ear measurement, you don't want to be doing it with all the features off. You want to be doing it with the features on because you want to find out what the hearing aid's doing like in real life. Like, is the digital noise reduction going to be used? Fine, do real ear with the digital noise reduction on. Remember how as ANSI requires, you got to turn everything off and let the hearing aid go full blast? Not with real ear. With real ear, you want to imitate what the hearing aid's doing in real life. Today's real ear measurement bypasses real ear unaided response. We don't care about it. And I italicized this on purpose, okay? Today's real ear actually originated in Canada with the DSL fitting method because Richard Seewald, the inventor of the DSL fitting method, took a dim view of real ear insertion gain. The targets provided by most fitting methods are based on hearing thresholds, and the hearing thresholds are obtained with headphones. And one of the whole underpinnings of the DSL fitting method is that real ear unaided response is bypassed when testing with insert or circumaural headphones because you've now plugged the ear. And when you've plugged the ear, you no longer have a cup open at one end and closed at the other end. You no longer have a quarter wave resonator. You have lost that. So if you didn't incorporate REUR in your test, why are you using it in your hearing? Your hearing aid test. So that's either Richard Seewald said, if you insist on using real ear insertion gain, which depends on real ear unaided response, right? It's real ear aided minus real ear unaided is real ear insertion gain. So if you're going to be using this, then you should have gotten your unaided hearing thresholds in a sound field. Because only in a sound field are your ears open, and only then are you truly incorporating the REUR. but we don't test in a sound field. We test under headphones. So here you go. So because today's real ear measurement bypasses real ear unaided, it then also bypasses real ear insertion gain. And the older fitting methods like now are, all those old methods all assumed linear hearing aids, which gave the same gain for all inputs. Older fitting methods, remember, showed only one target, namely for average speech inputs. As a result, for any particular fitting, the older real ear measurement showed one target because the hearing aids were linear and they're going to give the same gain for any input anyway. So who cares? Why have more than one target? Today's real ear assumes compression is being used. And because compression gives different gains for different inputs, you often see three targets. One for soft, one for average, and one for loud inputs. Newer real ear uses only real ear aided response. One real ear aided response for average inputs, one real ear aided response for soft inputs, and another real ear aided response for loud inputs. It's actually easier than the old real ear. Early real ear used REUR and REAR, and then the difference was real ear insertion gain. Remember, we're using only REAR, and that talks about output, not gain. And output is what's slamming into your eardrum. If newer real ear looked at gain per se, it would be looking at the difference between, well, this is kind of unaided SPL at the mic and aided SPL at the TM, but we're never doing that. We are looking at output. Real ear aided response, 3 times. One with soft inputs, one with average inputs, and one with loud inputs. And the main one is soft inputs. So you enter the audiogram just like you always did, and then measure real ear aided response. You're not sitting there having the hearing aid or the tube in the guy's ear with no hearing aid in it, and then holding the tube in place and putting the hearing aid on. You're just putting the tube in, putting the hearing aid on the tube, and going. So you're not looking at a difference measure. You're just real ear aided with soft inputs, real ear aided with average, real ear aided with loud. And you usually begin with average. That's your most important one. Your second one is soft, which is about 55, and your loud one's about 75 to 80. 65 is average, 55 is soft, 80 is loud. Okay? In general, that's essentially what we're doing. So now we can look at what we have here. Input plus gain is output. Let's make sure we can read this very carefully. Look at the lovely red and the lovely looking yellow and the pretty little green. Okay? On the side here, input plus gain equals output. Now really internalize this. If I have a soft input, and let's look at 1,000 hertz. Okay? If my input was 50, what's my output at 1,000? For soft inputs, 75. So I guess my gain must be 25. Okay, my input was 50. My output at 1,000 hertz is 75, and gain is the difference. Input plus gain is output. 50 plus 25 is 75. Now let's look at the yellow. At 1,000 hertz, we're considering that the input is 70. What's my output at 1,000 hertz for average inputs? Around 85. 85 minus 70 is 15. Okay, my input was 70. My output in this fictitious example happened to be 85, so my gain was 15. Now you're doing a loud input of 90. And what's my output? 95 at 1,000 hertz, see? So 95 minus 90 is a gain of only 5. And that's good old WDRC in action. Greatest gain for soft inputs, less gain for loud inputs. And when you're reading outputs here, okay, the top one is always the aided output for loud inputs. The bottom one is always the aided output for soft inputs. And that's just, always remember that, because that's very different from gain, okay? Because gain, look at this, goes exactly the opposite direction. Okay, if I was plotting this in terms of gain, I'd only have 5 dB of gain for loud inputs, more gain for average inputs, and more gain for soft inputs. But when you're plotting in output, it's more intuitive. The top one is for loud inputs. This one's for average inputs. And this is the output here for soft inputs. So it's more intuitive. Loudness growth, as we all know, okay, you want greatest gain for soft inputs, less gain for louder and louder inputs. Why? Because normal hearing, 10 to 20 is heard as soft. Normal hearing, 50 to 60 is heard as comfortable. Normal hearing, 90 to 100 is heard as too loud. Sensory neural hearing loss, mild to moderate in degree, which is the most popular. Now 50 to 60 is soft, and yet 100 is too loud. So the floor has become elevated, the ceiling has not. You're going to amplify soft sounds by a lot, average sounds by less, loud sounds by little or nothing at all. And this picture here is showing you the very same thing as this picture. Only this picture doesn't have frequency on it. This one does. Okay? The floor is elevated. And remember, this bottom curve is minimal audible pressure. This bottom curve is 0 dBHL. So here you're looking at things in HL. Here you're looking at the same loss in SPL. And you can tell that the lines are scrunched together. His floor is elevated. His loudness discomfort isn't. Okay, so this guy in red, his dynamic range is half of what the normal hearing dynamic range is, especially in the highs. I guess we'd use a 2-to-1 compression ratio here, because this dynamic range is around 50, whereas this dynamic range is around 100. See? So reduced dynamic range requires different amounts of gain for different input levels. So if you've got a hearing loss like the blue X's here, and imagine that that's sensory neural, then if I'm hearing a soft input of 5, look at the top green line, I can amplify that by the full degree of the loss. I can amplify it by 50. Now this green line's at 55. But if my input is now 60, I can't amplify it by the same degree. Now I'm going to amplify by half the degree of the loss. Half gain. And if my input is loud, I'm going to back off and hardly amplify it at all. So here's today's real ear and the good old SPLogram. Instead of audiogram, SPLogram. And today we call it speech mapping. So you're literally mapping aided outputs. And take good care to look at this slide carefully. Look at the green one. Can you see that the outputs here are barely above the threshold? That means that these outputs are barely audible. That's right, barely audible. If I'm speaking really softly to you, you'll barely hear what I'm saying either. So why should the hearing impaired with the hearing aid have any different experience? Soft speech is barely audible. So that's exactly where you want to place it for the hearing impaired person wearing hearing aids. You want it to be barely audible. Average speech, notice how the output isn't exactly in the center of the dynamic range. It's not. It's only about a third up. Okay? DSL-4, the old DSL-4 fitting method, it would aid so that the aided outputs for average inputs were in the center of the dynamic range. Many people found that too loud. So even though in theory you should be placing average inputs right into the center of the dynamic range, in reality the preferred option is so that if they're aided outputs for average speech inputs like 65 dB SPL should be sitting about a third above the thresholds. Here's another thing. Make sure that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the ones that are sitting about a third above the thresholds. In other words, 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. 5, 1, 2, and 4. Don't worry so much about 8. Don't freak too much about 125 and 250. The main thing is that 5, 1, 2, and 4 should all be above threshold so the person can easily hear those, especially for average inputs. And then loud inputs, you want to make sure that the outputs never quite reach loudness discomfort levels. Now these must be frequency specific loudness discomfort levels. Remember what we said in our notes. You can choose average UCLs, or you can choose measured UCLs. You can choose average real ear to coupler difference, or you can choose measured real ear to coupler difference. Now let's stop for a second there, because when you're talking average or measured real ear to coupler differences and stuff like that, what is that going to do? What if your measured real ear to coupler difference is different from the average real ear to coupler difference? What effect will that have on your speech map? Well, let's talk, okay? Or I'll say the words that men usually hate hearing the most. We need to talk. Okay, here we go. There are two things that give rise to minimal audible pressure. Okay, one of them is something called RETSPL, R-E-T-S-P-L. And that's reference equivalent threshold sound pressure level. Reference equivalent threshold sound pressure level. R-E-T-S-P-L. What is that? I'll tell you what it is. It's the difference between your dial reading. Let's say you have 1,000 hertz and it says 70 dBHL on your audiometer. What's actually coming out into a 2cc coupler? That's called RETSPL. Okay, RETSPL is the difference between your dial reading on your audiometer at any particular frequency and the actual output in SPL in a 2cc coupler. You got a mic stuck into the 2cc coupler, and you got the headphone on the other end of the 2cc coupler. And what's the sound coming out of that headphone into a 2cc coupler? When your dial reading is at 1,000 and the intensity is 70 dBHL, what SPL is coming into the 2cc coupler? That's called RETSPL. RETSPL takes you from the audiogram to the 2cc coupler. I mean the audiometer. From the audiometer to the 2cc coupler. So RETSPL is an audiometer thing. Now you want to move from the 2cc coupler to the real ear. And that's real ear to coupler difference. Okay? So those two things, now you've gotten from the audiometer to the ear. Okay? And what is MAP? What's the softest it takes to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone? Okay, and that's measured in dBSPL. But in your audiometer, to go from your audiometer to that point in your ear, you've got to add RETSPL plus real ear to coupler difference. RETSPL, the difference between your dial reading and the output from the headphone in a 2cc coupler. So RETSPL takes you from the audiometer to the 2cc coupler. RECD takes you from the 2cc coupler to the real ear. You can choose average RECDs, and I usually do when the person has a regular looking ear canal. That'll get you close enough for government work. If the person has a weird ear canal, then I would measure the RECD. And what will, let's say your measured RECD looks different from your average real ear to coupler difference. Let's say it does. What effect will that have? Well, let's look at what effect that would have. That would affect this, which in turn would affect thresholds. Right? What did we say MAP came from? RETSPL plus real ear to coupler difference. Now, in an audiometer, RETSPL is RETSPL is RETSPL. I mean, that's just built in, so that's not going to change. But RECD varies among people. So remember, this is average minimal audible pressure. But if a person's got a weird ear canal, these values will differ because his or her measured real ear to coupler difference will vary. So now you're taking RETSPL and you're adding the measured RECD to it as opposed to the average RECD. And you're going to get slightly different values here. And what did we say these thresholds in DBSPL came from? They came from, let's make sure we keep our act together here. They came from this plus this. So if this now has a different this to be added to it, if the black dotted lines are slightly different, then when you're adding different black dotted lines to the thresholds, this is going to change. Okay? And because this is going to change, your targets will change. So know the order, I guess, is what I'm saying. If you've changed, if your RECD is different from average, it's going to change your minimal audible pressure, which in turn is going to change your hearing threshold, which in turn is going to change your targets a little bit. Okay? I guess that's the issue, the thing I want to bring across and take home here. All righty. Now let's see where we are, where we're going here. WDRC showing on. Now let's just do a little bit of practice here. It's just good. We got 20 minutes left. Let's just take our time. We're not trying to finish this whole unit this week. We're just wading into the shallow end of the pool. So let's do it. Make sure we're looking at 240 from last semester. Make sure, because all these things are integrated together. Here, I'm going to drink on the job a second. Hang on. Billy. Okay. Linear gain shown on an input-output function. Notice the 1-to-1 input-output ratio, a 45-degree angle line, right? So if this hearing aid is providing a gain of 50, then 0 in is 50 out, 20 in is 70 out, 40 in is 90 out, 60 in is 110 out. And the difference between input and output consistently remains 50 until you reach the knee point, and now you've got peak clipping taking place, so the MPO can never go above, in this case, 120 dB-SPL. Okay? Look what it says here. 0 SPL input, 50 dB gain, 50 SPL output. 20 dB SPL input, 50 dB gain, 70 dB SPL output, and so on. Okay. WDRC shown on an input-output function. Now you haven't got the flat line here anymore. Your knee point is lower, and your linear gain takes place over a smaller range of input levels. And then all of a sudden at your knee point, your gain is going down. So while your input of 40 may in this case result in an output of 90, which is the same 50 dB of gain shown here, okay, the buck stops at the knee point, because now when I've increased my input by 20, my output only went up by 10. So now 60 in is 100 out, and the difference there is 40. And 80 in is 110 out. I went up by another 20, but my output only went from 100 to 110. Okay, so it's a 2-to-1 compression ratio in all actuality. So make sure we retain these concepts from 240 last semester. Now let's look at this slide. Let's figure out what the gains must be. Let's just look at 1,000 hertz. Now what you're looking at here is 3 different targets. They're the green ones. And you're looking at 3 different outputs from some fictitious hearing aid and how close they are to the targets. But for right now, forget about the red and the blue and the black. Just look at the green lines. So the bottom green line is what your output, what you want your output to be in this particular case. We're just choosing, we're just imagining something here, okay, for a 50 dB input. So a 50 dB input would have been painted in black here. Okay, but it's pretty close to the green. So for 50 dB, here's your target. The targets are green, and your actual inputs are these levels. But anyway, look at the greens. So this is your target for soft inputs. What's my output? About 75. So what's my input? 50. What's the difference? 25. Here's an average output for average inputs. Here you're at about 75. This would be about 85 here, and that would be 90. So I guess for a 70 dB input, my output here is 85, so that's a gain of 15. For a 90 dB input, my output's only about 95 at 1,000 hertz. 95 minus 90, I guess, must be a gain of only 5. So really make it your business to be able to look at a speech mapping slide in RealEar and look at the outputs and look at what the inputs are listed as, and the differences between them is the gain. So gain is not shown directly on these kind of slides. Gain is indirectly calculated from what the output is and what the input is. Therefore, the gain must be X. You see what I'm saying here? So let's look at here for a simple instance. Gain versus output. Okay? Gain decreases as inputs increase. That's what happens with WDRC, right? So look at the bottom left in yellow. Look here very carefully. In this particular case with this fictitious hearing aid, you're getting 20 dB of gain in the lows, about 30 dB of gain, something like that, in the highs for soft inputs. And then here, you're getting, as my inputs increase to 60, okay, now my gain goes down a little bit. And as my input increases to 80, my gain goes down even further. Now look to the right. This is the same hearing aid, only you're plotting things in output. Okay, so now look what happens. This 80 input here, you're getting virtually no gain in the low frequencies. And if my input is 80 and my gain is 0, my output's going to be 80, because 80 plus 0 is 80. Okay? And if my output here, or I should say if my gain here is 10 for an 80 dB input, then my output should be at about 90, because 80 and 10 is 90. Okay, so you're reading one in German and the other one's being read in Polish. You're telling exactly the same story, exactly. Okay, it's just that one's plotted in output, the other one's plotted in gain. And here's the rule: when you're plotting in gain, the top function represents the softest input, because you want WDRC is giving you the greatest gain for softest inputs. When you're looking at output, okay, that's a different kettle of fish. Then the top function represents the loudest input, and the bottom function represents the softest input. I mean, let's just make it make sense to ourselves. Look at 40 dB inputs. Whoa, 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 whoa. Here's 40 decibel inputs. What's my gain at this point right here? My gain is 30. So what's 40 plus 30? 70. Soft inputs, what's my output? 70. I guess my gain must be 30. All right, so this yellow one corresponds to this red one. This yellow one corresponds to this red one. And the middle is the middle. Okay, so notice how your axes, your numbers changed here, because now you're looking at output. Here your numbers are lower because you're talking about gain. But you're telling the very same story. The point I'm trying to drive home is that when you're plotting things in terms of gain, the top thing, the top function, looks at the softest inputs, greatest gain. When you're looking at things in terms of output, the top function represents the loudest inputs. So it's exactly opposite to what you think. Here's another trippy one here. Okay, this is kind of weird. What if you've got WDRC here, and you're looking at 10 dB of gain for all these inputs, because the hearing aid isn't providing hardly any low frequency gain at all. It's mainly a till hearing aid, isn't it? It's got WDRC taking place in the high frequencies. So how would I tell that story over here? Okay, that's the trick. So let's look at this one here, the top one. If I'm getting a 40 decibel input and the hearing aid is doing this in terms of gain, what's it doing in terms of output? Well, if I'm getting a gain of 10, 40 input plus a gain of 10 is an output of 50. If I'm getting here 40 decibel input and 40 dB of gain, I guess here I'm getting an output of 80. Okay, so it's the same story as is told here, but look at this. Look at, in terms of gain, these lines all meet together. If you're plotting this in output, look at how far apart they are. But don't freak, let the graph tell the story, okay? Because if my gain is going to be 10 dB for these 3 different inputs, 40 plus a gain of 10 is an output of 50. 60 plus a gain of 10 is an output of 70. 80 plus a gain of, I should say 80 dB input plus a gain of 10 here at this frequency is an output of 90. I'm not lying, I'm just telling the story, okay? The purpose of this exercise here for the last 10 minutes is mainly to get us to move from gain to output, to move from yesterday's real ear to today's real ear, to move from yesterday's fitting methods that talked about gain targets to today's fitting methods that talk about output targets. We're crossing the River Kwai, okay? We're crossing the river. When you cross the river, don't step in and fall off. Don't lean too hard against the rails. Look carefully and just understand the current. There's just a different kind of current here, okay? So look very carefully. Your homework is to look at these slides and try and make them match, because essentially they're telling the same story. Look at this input here, or look at this gain here for 80 decibel inputs. And look at this point right where my cursor is. The gain here for an 80 decibel input is 20. Okay, now look at output in terms of 80. Okay, 80 plus a gain of 20 is an output of 100. So the thing that's really weird here is that the more similar things look in terms of gain, the more different they're going to look in terms of output. But these things are telling exactly the same story, just using a different language. Okay, I think that's a great spot to end today. Really, truly, I think it is. Okay, this slide here is just explaining this one. Okay, so you're getting lines drawn to help you digest it. And this slide here is explaining this one. Okay, that's all you're doing. So look carefully at this and it'll really help you sort things out, switching from gain to output. All right, so probe tube measures today, we're mainly looking at NAL1, NAL2, or DSL5. These are the 3 fitting methods mainly used today. And of these 3, the best 2 to use are these. There's not lots of difference between them. Little bit. DSL5 asks for a little bit more output than NAL2. In general, a little bit, a few dB, okay, but not much. We need to remember how these 2 NALs differ from each other. NAL1 tends to have a bit of a bump in the mid-frequencies. NAL2 sort of flattens things out. NAL1 asks for more in the mids. NAL2 asks for a little more in the highs and the very lows, but less in the mids. And if you remember that from earlier units, that's mainly how NAL1 differs from NAL2. DSL5 is a lot like NAL2, it just asks for a little bit more. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it doesn't matter which ones you use, because you know what happens? After you tweak the hearing aid to match individual preferences, you've lost the differences between the 2 methods anyway. Think of them as a way to get you into the ballpark. Well-researched methods from opposite ends of the globe. NAL2 from Australia, DSL5 from that pinko commie country to the north of you, okay? So basically, these are the general fitting methods used today. Manufacturers also have proprietary fitting methods, but we won't talk very much about those because in general, they're crummy. Stick to NAL2 and DSL5. We'll talk more about this stuff though, because I want you to realize that the different manufacturers incorporate NAL 2 differently. And the different manufacturers all incorporate DSL5 differently. Did you know that? DSL5 on Phonak isn't exactly like DSL5 with Oticon, isn't exactly like DSL5 in Unitron, isn't exactly the same as DSL5 on Starkey. The companies buy the rights to these methods, but they tweak them all a little bit. The only place you're ever going to find true NAL 1, true NAL 2, true DSL5 is on the real ear equipment. That's the only place you're going to find it. The other ones are all twisting them slightly to match their own ends and needs. I think this is a good point to cease talking today, but that's basically, we'll pick up on this next week, and we'll start with those transition slides again, from gain to output, and then we'll keep moving ahead in this unit. So there, I'm done. I'll stop recording.